Hi, I'm Jed. This is Cook Culture. So today we're talking about coffee and we're going deep into coffee. So I went down to see my friend Ben Cram, who owns Fernwood Coffee, and they have a cafe in Victoria called the Parsonage. And we got really detailed about coffee because I want to know clearly the process of making the best bean for what machine. So if you're gonna have a fully automatic coffee machine, we sell Jura machines, and if you're gonna be buying something similar, what is the best bean? How does that work? If you're gonna do a pour over style, if you're gonna do a French press, what is the best bean? And does the bean matter, or is it all about the grind? And the combination of amount of coffee and the amount of water and all the specifics behind it. So I went and saw Ben. We talked from the beginning process of how the seed or the cherry, the fruit is grown, right to how he then roasts it. So it's a very in-depth video. I've separated this into chapters for you so you can skip ahead to what's important to you and kind of take what you want, or listen to this in an audio. I've gone through it in detail. This could make a really good podcast if you want to. So however you enjoy it, I hope it's worthwhile for you. Please, any questions, throw them below. And this is part one of 2 parts. So we've got a lot of information. So this is the first video that is really about how the bean gets ready to be made. And then we'll have our second video that'll come out in a few weeks. That is the process of making the coffee from the beans in which we've talked about in this video. So I hope you enjoy. Here you go. All right, so I'm in my hometown of Victoria, BC, Fernwood Coffee. Come to see my friend Ben. He's gonna tell me all about how we're going to be able to decide on which coffee works for what machine. So I'm excited to learn more about coffee. Let's go. Okay, so I'm here with my friend Ben. Hey Ben, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
Awesome. So as I was saying before, I've come to Ben to answer the question, how do we buy the right coffee for the right machine? So Ben has a pretty extraordinary business. He is one of a few amazing craft roasters here in Victoria. My personal favorite. I'm a little biased. But I really appreciate the way that Ben does his job for the machines that I sell. And I'm not totally sure why that works, but the Jura coffee machines and some of the other gear that we sell, his beans work really, really well. And I have some customers that are like, oh, well, what about this bean and what about that bean? And I don't know enough about coffee to answer some of those nuances. So here we are. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, no problem.
What I want to try to get into is, if I'm a regular everyday Joe and I enjoy coffee and I know a little bit about coffee and but I don't really know what I'm doing when I go to a wall of coffee in the grocery store, or if I go to come into a cafe like yours and you even have 5 different types of coffees. I have espresso. Do I have to buy espresso for my espresso machine, or what do I do, right? So I wanted to just kind of start a little bit at the beginning of what is coffee? Like, what happens? You get it from somewhere, something happens to it, you get it ready somehow, and then it goes in a bag, and then what is the expectation, or what are you trying to say to somebody when you make different types of coffee? So, the end result, what I'm hoping here is that somebody who's watching could be like, right, okay, I have that knowledge. So what I'm hoping we're going to do here is have this conversation, and then we're also going to make some coffee. So, if we could start there, Ben, if you could just kind of start at the kind of the beginning for us.
Okay, I'll give you kind of the cliff notes.
Great.
So coffee's grown basically in a band around the equator, warm climates, high altitude usually. And the structure of how it's farmed changes from country to country. Some countries, it might be just sort of an ancillary thing to someone who grows oranges, or often farms grow multi-crop, and coffee is one of the things that they grow, which, in the really progressive biodiverse farms, the one crop shades the coffee grows better in shade, things like that. So it's a really interesting agriculture. When you get into sort of Central America and South America, you get into giant farms where they're growing and processing the coffee right on site.
And does that mean that it's bad? Big coffee plantations?
No, not at all, because it's just a different style of farming. So in some ways it's even better, because when I say processing, coffee's grown as a cherry, and then it needs to be processed to the point where it's a green coffee bean, and that's the product we get.
Okay. So does it have, like, you mean like a cherry, like it's got flesh around it, around the
Yeah,
seed?
so it looks like a cherry. It's a red berry, and the reason coffee, they're actually seeds, not beans, but the reason coffee beans are flat is that there's 2 seeds per cherry, and they grow face to face.
Oh, cool.
So that's why they grow as a circle that splits into 2, basically.
Okay.
And so there's different ways to get from a cherry to a green coffee bean, different methods of processing, and they influence flavor. So on those big farms, they may have a bit more control versus say a lot of the African farms, and this is a generalization, it's not always true, but a lot of the African farms are small stakes where someone might grow enough to just make a few sacks of coffee a year in addition to other things that they do. And those get amalgamated at a mill where multiple farmers are amalgamating their crops, and that all gets blended. Yeah, and that all gets blended together. And you still get phenomenal coffees, but you're not necessarily getting, a farm where someone has laid out a grid and said, oh, the coffee on the west face from this patch of land is all going to be processed together because we find it's really unique, and we're going to sell it as a micro lot that's really special.
Yeah.
So
and is this kind of where we get these kind of strange names and costs that start to escalate? If
yeah, you
more
can, for sure. You definitely can.
Cost?
Well, the Ethiopian coffees are some of the best coffees in the world, so they can still demand a high price because the quality's so good. Okay. And once they're kind of mixed, you'll get a sort of homogenized profile that's incredible. And there are, farms that specialize even from those countries as well. Okay. So I hope I'm not making it more complicated.
No, I think the journey of where it comes from, I think, is fascinating. I guess in my mind, I've seen the little red berries in pictures, but didn't really think about, what happened from that point. Something that, side note, interestingly, like the flesh around the seed, what happens to that? What is that?
That's, so in the last sort of decade, you've seen a product called cascara that is the dried flesh of the coffee cherry, and people brew it as tea. Okay. And it's really good. It's a caffeinated, almost like rosehip tea, like a sweet tart. The cherries are actually quite tasty if you eat them.
And do you guys make the tea or sell the tea?
We have over the years brought in cascara, so it's something that we made at origin because you're taking this fresh fruit product and it has to be dried right then and there so that there's no rot or anything. Yeah. And then also lots of farms are very progressive in using that waste to fertilize future crops as well. So it can either go back into the ecosystem, or there's this cascara product, which is really interesting. I've seen a few cascara cold drinks come out on the market recently.
So whatever that I can find for that'll be in the notes below the video. That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. So it's a great spot to go into processing, because processing is actually one of the most important factors in the flavor of coffee, and that's how you get from cherry to green coffee. Okay. So there's 2 extremes. One is washed coffee, and one is called natural coffee. Natural, they're both completely natural. Natural is just the name of the process for the sort of one extreme where you take the cherries and you dry them as whole cherries. Okay. They're laid out in raised beds, usually landscape cloth, so there's airflow all around, and they need to be turned constantly because you want to avoid any kind of rot or mold, and you want them to dry out. And then once that process is done, you pulp the meat off, and you get your coffee bean, the green coffee bean. That process, you're absorbing a lot of the sugars and the fruit flavors from the cherry, because there's that long prolonged contact. Okay.
So as it, like, and I guess I haven't got that quite clear. So you've got the drying in these raised beds, so it air's all around. And is that just naturally fermenting? Is it just naturally drying?
There's probably some fermentation going on, but it's a fairly quick process.
But that's where the water's evaporating from the and it just starts to all dry out.
Yeah,
and then,
so
how
almost
do you
like a
remove
raisin.
the flesh from the seed?
They have machines that they'll load in, and they kind of mill the flesh off. Okay. So then the opposite end of the spectrum is a wash coffee, where they pulp that fruit off right away while it's fresh, get it all off, and then soak it, and that's where you get fermentation, and they're removing any mucilage of the fruit, and that's called wash coffee. Yep. And then in between, you have a sort of full range of what people sometimes call pulped natural, or honey process is another name, where they pulp off some of the fruit and they'll lay it out to dry in that mucilage, which is similar to laying it out as the whole cherry. And you'll kind of get, some people say, the best of both worlds. So the differences that you're going to get, and this is anecdotal, my opinion, but in wash coffees, you really taste terroir. You taste where the coffee is grown. And at the opposite end, on that natural, you're going to taste a lot of the influence of the fruit. So the coffee cherry tastes similar, wherever it's grown. It won't be identical, but you're going to taste that fruit flavor, and it'll be present wherever that's grown if it's processed naturally.
So is this having it these two ways? Is this a personal preference from a roaster's when you're buying the bulk?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not like, wash is just cheap stuff, and I always want it done this way.
There's some people who have strong opinions on it. To me, it's just variety. Okay. It just makes things more interesting.
So if you're in the grocery store and you're trying to decide on that, and is that going to make any influence? Do you find that makers like yourself use that as a marketing term, like this is washed or this is natural?
Yeah, that's more in sort of the specialty. In grocery, I would say you're looking at majority washed coffees. Okay. Or you might get some blends where there's a little bit of natural coffee blended in to kind of boost a flavor. But for the most part, it's going to be washed coffees. And the reason I would think for that is washed coffees taste like coffee traditionally. Okay. You can get natural coffees that people taste it and they're like, whoa, what's going on here? I'm tasting is this a flavored coffee? Right. I taste blueberry. I taste strawberry.
And that's where you get all those tasty notes that are written on the package, and they're selling on all these fancy names.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
and that you're not going to get that. So if you see a package with all of those little fancy names and stuff, that's mostly going to, or always going to be a natural. And the wash is going to be pretty much generic coffee flavorish, but more.
People will add tasting notes to all coffees at the high end level for sure, but where you'll get the sort of outlandish tasting notes like wine gum and bonbon, like
or caramel.
Naturals definitely have more distinct flavors.
Right. Okay.
And
just so for people kind of watching, so if you like that kind of coffee, you should start to go towards your local roaster instead of buying it from a grocery store.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. To me, I always, if we bring on new employees who are just getting into coffee and I really want to sort of deep dive them, I call it the gateway drug. I'll give them like the most extreme natural coffee. I won't say anything. We'll set up a tasting with a bunch of washed coffees and one natural coffee. Right. And you watch their reaction.
Okay.
And then they realize the spectrum all of a sudden of like, whoa, coffee can be this extreme.
Yeah.
I often see people the first few times they taste it, that's all they want to drink for a little while. And then you kind of get burnt out on it. And you sort of, most people will sort of come back to wash coffees and that love of the clean, sort of clean, unaffected flavor of the actual seed versus that fruit influenced flavor. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got ourselves to a green bean now. Yeah. It's either natural or washed.
Yeah.
And it's good. It's packaged, I guess, and now it goes into the ship.
Yeah, and then so we purchase coffee different ways. We purchase through brokers who do a lot of they always joke, some of the guys we work with, we taste a lot of bad coffee, so you don't have to. Right. Which we do to a lesser degree as well, because we get hundreds and hundreds of samples that we try to choose what coffees we're going to roast.
Yeah. And that will change throughout the year. Like you'll get it from different places, and you mix, because you always call your coffees the same thing, right? So like your 1976 will change.
We have that one's super consistent. So we have our
Ben's
blends.
1976 is his espresso bean. It's a very consistent one, and it works really, really well for me on Jura machines. That's why I reference it.
So that's one of our blends that we have that are consistent throughout the year, and we have long-standing relationships where we're purchasing in quantities to keep it as consistent as possible, and we're tasting it for consistency. Okay. Then we have our single origin coffees, which we're bringing in seasonally as they're harvested when they're in season. So different countries have different harvest times depending which side of the equator they're on and how the seasons work. And so those are a sort of a separate line of coffee that we rotate throughout the year. And we have some farms that we buy from every year because we love what they do, and we have other farms where we just taste something phenomenal and we want it as a one-off, and we roast it, and then we have
that'll be sold in the cafe and doesn't go out for commercial.
So some places will sell that as well.
So if you're familiar with Fernwood Coffee, you'll see it in places like Whole Foods and Thrifty Foods and lots of different types of grocery stores. And it comes in a different package. So he'll do a commercial line and then
kind of a boutique line.
A boutique line, It comes in the fancier packaging. It's really pretty.
So we have one farm in Brazil that we work with every year, and we go there. We haven't the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but we travel to that farm. We're planning this year's trip, and we kind of get first access. And that's one of those farms where we do get to taste micro lots, and he'll pull things aside, and we've gotten to the point where we can actually influence how things are processed. Can this stay in the fermentation tank longer? Does that work? And he'll explain, like, yeah, we could try that, or no, we can't for this reason. He's third generation coffee farmer, went to university as an agronomist, and Ed, who does our roasting, they've become fast friends. Like, they visit each other. He's come here to see what we do. He actually sent us a video once of him riding through. He checks his crops on horseback, and he's galloping through a coffee field, and he's wearing a Fernwood Coffee shirt, holding his phone up, filming himself. So it's fun for us.
That's great to have those kind of relationships.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And so we'll try and travel there for sure, and then to other origins as well as we can. To really sort of source the coffee, where instead of getting recommendations from a broker, we're getting to taste hundreds of coffees on site and really choose our favorites.
So from a purchaser's point of view, you're sitting at home, and that's great and fun and interesting. But what is that? What would you think if you're just a layperson buying coffee? Is that what you want to go for? Does that make a bigger difference, or why would you come to a micro roaster that has a relationship with a farmer in Brazil and can do these kind of things? What is the benefit, and why would you go to that extra effort than just buying what's off the shelf in the grocery store?
Access to quality, for sure.
Okay. And what does quality equate to?
So care in every step of the process. Mm-hmm. So,
but I guess when you put lips to mouth, right? Lips to cup. What does that mean?
Cleaner flavors, more consistency, no defects. We haven't gotten into roast shade yet, but to roast lighter, you need to have better quality coffee.
Okay.
So when I talk about roast shade, I'll explain what that means.
Okay.
Because I'm not a super coffee snob that coffee has to be roasted really light, which is, you'll see some people kind of push that as an agenda. But
like for instance, and this is not trying to pick out one over the other, but Elysian Coffee over in Vancouver is very much about light coffee.
Yeah.
And we struggled to make it work with some of our coffee machines.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting, and what it came down to, and I didn't know why, and what I learned was that they really focus on light coffee.
Yeah.
And that's become problematic with certain machines.
Yeah, and light I think it's harder to do a light roast really well.
Right.
Is
their coffee, when we go and do a cupping at Elysian, just blows your mind. It's so good. Yeah. Then you go and try to make it in a whatever, in a mocha master or whichever, and it's watery.
Yeah, it's harder to brew well. It's harder to roast well. So you really have to dial it in more carefully, and that's where you get down that kind of rabbit hole of coffee nerdism, where you've got multiple scales and you're searching for that perfect recipe, and then you can replicate it.
Right.
And that's going to evolve as you get your next bag, because something may have changed slightly in the flavor profile. And it's a rabbit hole some people really enjoy in their daily ritual, and other people are just looking to, set and forget and hit one button and have a nice consistent cup of coffee.
Yeah.
So
I think, from my perspective of dealing with, the amount of people that I do at a retail level, is that I find that people, they want the very best experience for the least amount of effort, right? So it's like, they're not like, oh yeah, just give me whatever. They're like, I'm willing to spend the money and get myself prepared, but as long as I then don't have to have a hobby after the fact.
Yeah, right? And you want to find that balance.
Yeah.
And so there are definitely ways to find that balance. And things like choosing roast shade will affect that, and also how you drink your coffee. Like if you put heavy cream and sugar in your coffee and that's how you enjoy it, those lighter coffees are going to get washed out and taste really watery, and it'll taste like creamy, sugary water, Whereas that's where a dark roast, that person might much prefer dark roast, because the bitter flavors that are coming out balance really well when you sweeten them up.
Right.
And you get sort of chocolatey flavors. So I always tell people there's nothing wrong with dark roast coffees. It's sort of how you choose to drink the coffee that'll lend itself to success.
That's what I hope we get into kind of near to the end of what we're doing here, is that as we try to balance, which coffee are we going to pick off the shelf to match with which method are we doing, right? Yeah. So I hope, once we go to Cook Culture and make some coffee, that's what I'm hoping we can get that balance, so that we can try to give, I hope that at the end we're not being like, okay, well, here's all the information, and then, you can kind of do whatever. It'd be nice if we're like, this really works with this type of machine, this really works with this type of machine, and get some clarity on, the best way to choose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've got lots of good tips to lead people in right directions. I always tell people, like, once you've sort of figured out the fundamentals of how to brew coffee well, have fun with it, and try different things, and kind of learn all the rules and then throw them out. I always tell people, right? Once you know why you're doing something, you can kind of start playing around with it.
Sure. So green beans show up here.
Yeah.
Right? We're in Victoria.
Yeah. And then our initial step is, actually it's right behind you, the sample roaster. So this roasts, as you can see, a tiny amount of coffee. It roasts what goes in there. So this works with an app on our phone, and we can actually, on the fly, alter the temperature, airflow, everything. So we can try a bunch of different profiles that actually will translate to our full-size roaster.
That is wild.
So
can you buy one of these for home and roast your own?
There's a number of different home roasters out there. Yeah, okay, this
one. Like I've seen many of them. Yeah. I've never seen them this style. I've seen like Swiss Bar made one. I don't remember that one.
The little drum roasters.
Yeah, they're just cumbersome, and but I've never seen something as tight and as clean as that.
Yeah, so this is an air roaster. Slightly cost prohibitive for a consumer, but if you were really into it, you'd be
those Swiss Bar ones weren't cheap, right?
You'd be brewing, or roasting 2 cups of coffee at a time, kind of thing. But hey, there are people who do it.
Yeah, you plug it from the back. That's pretty.
So here, pardon my reach. We'll get samples like this, and we can get a bunch of roasts out of this.
Okay, so that's a Columbia with a number on it.
Yeah, and so we identify everything by the number. And so what we'll do is we'll roast a bunch of different profiles of a different coffee and get what we think tastes best. And that's kind of done by committee. Our staff taste it. And we do this with all our different samples that we get in. And then we come up with what we call our production profile. And that, once it's on the big roaster, is mapped in real time. So there's a graph running showing
like a digital graph,
time over temperature. Yeah. And so we can fine tune and tweak a roast. The interesting thing is that's called your roast profile, and you can roast a coffee to the exact same shade, but if that curve on the graph is different, it won't taste exactly the same.
Okay.
And when I first learned about profile roasting years ago, when I kind of started my research on roasting coffee, I went to a class where they had the same coffee roasted to the same shade, and they had 5 different profiles. And there was a room of probably about 40 to 50 people. And so we all tasted, and you weren't sharing results. It was completely silent, and everyone's writing their notes. And 90% of the class chose the same profile.
Okay.
So it was sort of like illustrating that there are optimal profiles that will kind of please the most people.
Okay.
You're trying to control bitterness, you're trying to control acidity. There's good acidity and bad acidity, so you want like nice brightness, but you don't want sourness. And then sweetness is kind of the thing that you're trying to promote. That's the hardest thing to bring out. So we'll play with profiles to try and get the best tasting profile for that coffee. We won't necessarily fixate on what shade it's going to be. Generally for us, our coffees, our single origins always sort of fall into a lighter medium shade. We don't go super light because we want full development. And often I find if people are trying to roast really light, the coffee ends up getting underdeveloped and tasting kind of grassy or green. So yeah.
Okay. So you'll then roast off like a bit of that and keep some green and then roast as you need, or you just like do the entire batch when it arrives?
No, at that point, we roast in batches. So we'll, depending on how much we bought of that coffee, we'll roast it in fairly small batches and so that it's always going out fresh.
Okay.
Freshness is key in coffee. So
so if that said, you're going to buy your coffee and you could go to the grocery store or go to your close roaster. How do you do that? Like if you're in the grocery store, are you looking for a roast date, or do they have to have like a best before date, or how do you know what's fresh?
So coffee should ultimately have a roast date on them. For our grocery coffees, we were running into a problem that people often thought that our coffee was past due because the roast date obviously has already happened.
Right, of course.
So ours is actually held in a code, which we're happy to share with people.
Yeah.
So it's easy to figure out if you know the code, and it's just in our lot number.
Yeah.
And we work really hard to control inventory where we wholesale coffee. So if we're selling to Whole Foods, places like that, we'll actually restrict the amount that they can order and want them to order more often so that we know that the coffee is going out fresh all the time.
Yeah.
Any of our single origin coffees will have the roast date right on them. And again, it's this thing where you can be super snobby about it and be like, coffee should only be roasted within a week.
Yeah.
To me, I've just gone over this whole process of how much hard work goes into producing green coffee at a farm level, and often they're not making enough money.
Right.
They should be making more for what they are. Whole other conversation.
Right.
But to say, oh, this coffee's over a week old and throw it out, to me is like a disgrace.
Sure.
The thing I go by,
more coffee.
drink more coffee. And the thing I go by is this coffee's at its best for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And really good for up to 3 months.
Okay. Great. That's a great point.
I'm not, when you get into espresso, it's maybe a slightly smaller window, but I don't necessarily think the coffee tastes worse. The flavor will change and it'll evolve, but it's not necessarily like, oh, it's 2 weeks old now, it's terrible.
Yeah,
it's 2 weeks old and maybe this flavor note mellowed and this flavor note came out a bit more.
Yeah.
You'll get to a point where it stales.
There's an off-gassing process, right, of where it needs to rest for a certain amount of time, anyways.
Yeah, for filter coffee, you want to rest it for a couple of days.
Yeah.
So generally not something the consumer even has to think about because of the time it gets packaged and out the door onto a shelf. That's taking care of itself. For espresso, you want coffee that's at least 5 days old.
Okay.
If it's too fresh, you won't get nice crema. It'll be really inconsistent. It'll be hard to dial in. And so that window of kind of 7 to 20 days is actually great for espresso. And espressos that have natural coffee in them, to me, taste better with more age on them.
Okay.
So, in fact, even as filter coffee, a lot of naturals I really like with a bit more age on them as well.
Okay. So we'll get into the roasting profiles when you show me roasting, but the single largest question that I personally have, and that I actually kind of struggle with at a store level when I'm talking to people about, especially buying a Jura or anything that you're spending a couple of grand on.
Yeah.
When you're buying espresso bean, what is an espresso bean? Like you got a roast of one type and then an espresso type, and they're sitting beside each other in the store.
Yeah, the huge misconception that it's something specific it is made to brew as espresso, but there's subtle differences that in the roast for us, and that's only because we're like, hey, when we roast like this, we find it tastes better as espresso. You can brew espresso as filter coffee, and it's usually delicious.
Okay.
You can put any coffee in an espresso machine and make espresso shots,
right.
and some work great, some don't.
Mostly really dark, oily, doesn't work well in fully automatic machines. Just FYI.
Yes.
Yeah, Starbucks, no go.
So the idea is, again, I'm kind of like throw those rules out.
Yeah.
If you feel like buying an Ethiopian coffee and trying it as espresso and it's a single origin, go for it.
Right.
It could be delicious.
Yeah. And why do you say an Ethiopian, like, can't you get an espresso roast in an Ethiopian?
Yeah, you could. When something is labeled as espresso, that's a coffee that the roaster has. It usually denotes that it's a blend. It's not one origin of coffee.
Okay.
And it is something that roaster has formulated to taste good as espresso.
Okay.
To taste good brewed in that brew
They
method.
like it for making espresso. Under that kind of pressure, creating that kind of crema. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so there's, you'll go to high-end coffee shops that'll have 3 grinders, and one is their espresso blend, and then they're doing 2 single origin espressos, so that you can really, taste that specific coffee.
Yeah.
But again, that idea of kind of throwing out the rules. When I first got into coffee, I was told you cannot brew Kenyan coffee as espresso.
Okay.
It was just like an industry rule.
Right.
And now it'd be really common to see someone say, I'm going to do a single origin Kenyan for you to try. I've seen it done in barista competitions.
Right.
So, things evolve and rules change.
Yeah, fair. Okay. Okay, so roasting, we've talked about the process, of espresso, which I think is really important to talk about specifically, but we've got the green bean. You're going to then decide what the best process is and choose your bean to your roasting.
Yeah.
And then, so how does that happen? How do you roast coffee?
So there's two main ways. This is an air roaster, so it's similar to if you think your home popcorn popper.
Okay.
Where you're forcing hot air through, and it's being agitated by that hot air. And then there's drum roasting, and some people prefer one, some prefer the other. I prefer drum roasted coffee.
Yep.
So drum roasting is similar to like a clothes dryer, where you have a rotating drum and a heat source.
Yep.
And so in our case, it's natural gas forced through these ceramic burners at a super high temperature, and they're just sitting below the drum, and the drum's spinning. And it's about a 12 to 15 minute process.
Okay.
So the green coffee gets dropped in.
How much are you doing in yours? How many pounds?
We do around 20 kilos at a time.
Okay.
Yeah. And then so you lose about 15% of your weight in the roasting process. Yeah. And you actually gain volume. Which is a funny thing when we start talking about caffeine content. Okay. Because it's a question I get asked so much, and people say, "Oh, light coffee has more caffeine." I've heard roasted coffee.
What they say on the street, right?
So I always tell people it depends on if you're measuring at home by volume or by weight.
Okay.
So if you think of something getting bigger and lighter, the amount of caffeine in one coffee bean stays consistent throughout the process.
Yeah.
So if I'm scooping a dark coffee, I'm literally scooping less coffee beans because they've expanded.
Sure.
If I'm weighing, and I'm again to dark coffee, I'm putting more in because they weigh less. Yeah. Right. So if you're going by volume, the darker coffees will have more caffeine because you're gonna have to, less caffeine because you're scooping less. Right. If you're going by weight, the darker coffee is going to have more because you're putting more beans in to get that weight.
Great.
So
and when we start making some coffee, I really do want to have that conversation around, like, at home, what's the easiest, scooping or measuring? Like, is there that tipping point to somebody to tell them, you really should get a little scale. It's going to make a massive difference, that sort of thing. So I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah.
Right. Great. That's awesome. So can we take a look at the roasting?
Yes.
Awesome. coffee at Cook Culture.
Sounds good.
All right.
Okay, there you go. Video 1 of 2 videos done. So that's all the information on the bean, how we get it to the point of making the coffee. I hope that was educational for you. I hope it helps you decide on what bean you're kind of focusing on. The next video, we're gonna go into Cook Culture in Victoria and make different types of coffee and explain the process of how to get the right type of grind and weight and water and what we should be using for each machine to get the maximum coffee flavor. So thanks so much. Any questions, please throw it below and we'll see you in video 2.